So in this case, since pi can either only have been pound defined or not, one of these cout statements, but not the other cout statement, will end up in the translation unit, and from there passed on to the compiler. Another conditional compilation directive is the pound if. Now, whereas ifdef and ifndef are controlled by whether some token has been in a pound define directive or not in a pound define directive, if evaluates some expression to determine whether that expression is 0 or non-zero. For example, let's suppose that we have a program that needs to execute different code depending on whether the number of bytes in a long is 4 or 8 or something else. Well, we can say if the size of a long is equal to 4, now that expression is going to be either true or false. That is treatable as non-zero or 0. So if the size of a long is 4, then we will pass the cout statement displaying probably 32-bit processor along to the translation unit. Otherwise, notice that we can have, following our pound if, we can have a series of pound elifs, which simply means else if. So else if the size of a long is 8, we'll pass along this statement saying that this is probably a 64-bit processor. Following your if and all your elifs, if any, you're also allowed to have a final else. So if the size of the long is not 4 and the size of the long is not 8, we will get down to the else part and we'll pass along this statement to the preprocessor saying an unusual processor. And then finally, notice that the if has to be concluded with and if. Okay, so we've introduced several preprocessor directives. We've got pound include, pound define, pound ifdef, pound ifndef, pound endif, which ends those. We've also got pound if, pound elif, pound else, and pound endif again, which ends the pound if directive. We're going to take a look next at an example of a translation unit. This particular example is something produced by the GNU C++ compiler, G++. The translation unit produced by G++ is relatively easy to understand. It is human readable and it is easy to store into a file that you can look at. And it illustrates the general idea about what happens when the preprocessor runs to convert from the source code that you wrote into a translation unit, which is then passed along to the compiler. Different compilers will have their own unique notation that they use within their translation units. So let's first assume that we have a header file, foo.h, that contains 3 lines of code. The first line of code is a comment that just says the name of this file is foo.h. The second line of code is a pound define directive that defines the token, capital PI, to be replaced by the sequence of characters 3.1415 blah 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 383. The third line of code is a declaration of a function named ABC followed by a comment. Then over here on slide 9 we have a code file, foo.cpp, which has also a sequence of lines of code. Slides 10 and 11 show the translation unit that results when we compile this code file, foo.cpp, using the GNU C++ compiler. It would be handy here if I had 4 screens, but we're stuck with 2, so we're going to do the best we can. Okay, so we compile the foo.cpp file, compile in the general sense, and as the preprocessor scans through this source code, the first line that the C preprocessor encounters is a comment line. Now, a comment is simply ignored. So in the translation unit, which I'll skip ahead to on slide 10, the line of code that gets passed into the translation unit is actually this empty line here between the line above that says pound space 1 double quote foo.cpp, and the line below that says pound space 1 double quote foo.h. All right, so in the translation unit, all these lines that start with pound signs are not lines from our source file. These are lines that provide information to the compiler phase, that is what comes after the preprocessor, so that the compiler will understand which file and which line in each file these lines of code are from. So, in the translation unit, and again this is just for GNU C++, the first line in the translation unit is pound space 1 space foo.cpp, which means that we're working on line 1 of the foo.cpp source code file. The next two lines, pound 1 built-in, pound 1 command line, frankly I'm not sure what the pound 1 built-in is about. Pound 1 command line is apparently indicating that I ran this compiler from the command line, which I did. And then the fourth line in the translation unit says pound 1 foo.cpp. That means to the compiler, dear compiler, this next line of source code that I'm about to show you is line 1 from the foo.cpp file. In the actual source code, that line is a comment, and the preprocessor eliminates comments. So once we've eliminated that comment, there is nothing left. And consequently, what we have here following the pound 1 foo.cpp is a blank line. All right? Now, immediately following line 1 in the CPP file is line 2 in the CPP file. And that is a preprocessor directive saying include foo.h. And what we do is pull in and process an entire copy of foo.h. Now, here's foo.h from slide 8, and in foo.h, line 1 is a comment, / file : foo.h. The preprocessor strips out the comment and throws it away. So, after preprocessing, line 1 in foo.h is a blank line. The second line in foo.h is a pound define directive. This tells the preprocessor to create a pound define for the token pi so that later in the source code, when the token pi appears, that token will be replaced with the sequence of characters 3.1415, etc. Once the preprocessor has established that pound define for itself internally, what remains on that source code line is nothing. So the second line of foo.h, which I'm hoping you can tell because I'm kind of waving my cursor at it here on slide 10. The second line of foo.h becomes an empty source code line. And then we get down to the third line of foo.h, and the third line of foo.h is a declaration. The preprocessor simply passes that declaration along into the translation unit so that the compiler will understand that we have this top-level function named ABC that takes two ints as arguments and that returns an int. We've completed processing the foo.h file, so we flip back to continuing with the foo.cpp file, and we find ourselves at line 3 in the foo.cpp file. And line 3 in the foo.cpp file is the declaration of the main function followed by a comment, and the comment is stripped out and thrown away. Line 4 in the CPP file is shown at the top of page 11, or slide 11 here, and it is the curly brace that starts the definition of main. So the curly brace is the next line that we see in the translation unit. Going back to the source code for the main function definition in foo.cpp, we come to an ifdef directive. We're asking, is pi a pound defined token? And indeed it is. It was pound defined in the foo.h file. Consequently, the lines between ifdef pi and else are passed through to the translation unit. Now the line containing ifdef pi itself just becomes a blank line over here,